Okay, this particular case study then, it's interesting because it shows the overlap between a variety of different kinds of imagery technique. And there is a tendency for people to, in the Jungian world, to separate them off as if they are completely different in kind. But those differences are superficial with respect to how the effect is achieved, which is deep structure, and very often it's psychophysiological. In this particular case, then, we had a man in his 50s, and his background broadly was that he was a very strict Irish Roman Catholic, and that formed the core of his value system and his beliefs. It has regulated his family and the family dynamics, of course, for the whole of his life, and previous to his lifetime, back over many, many generations. So the family system then had that as its core value and belief system. Now, as a result of something which had happened in his early life, he developed a disorder called psoriasis, which involves, in some cases, very severe cases, and he had been this bad that his entire body was covered in a lesion, which involved raised skin, which scaled over. Incredibly itchy, socially disfiguring, crippling in many, many ways psychologically. And this poor man had suffered like this, as I say, for many decades. And he'd sought all sorts of kinds of treatments, medical treatments, primitive ones, but they were used, which included covering his body in tar and then scraping it off and scraping the psoriasis off, the skin lesion off itself. He'd had goodness knows how much cortisone, and that was beginning to thin his skin out and affect that. He had psychological help, and he'd even gone to the Dead Sea, where people with psoriasis are told to go and bathe themselves in the high salinity waters there, because that is supposed to affect it positively in some cases. And because he was Christian, and specifically a Catholic in this case, he believed, he thought consciously, that that would be helpful. A little bit like going to Lourdes. For some believing Christians, that helps them. Well, he went and it didn't help him. And he was desperate. Now, his daughter worked at the medical centre where Pauline and I were based at the time. That was a problem because he knew about us through her, but it was so personal for him that to expose his vulnerability to goodness knows what, he thought psychologically, he didn't particularly want his daughter to know that he was coming in to see us, and certainly not what it was about. So when she approached me, it was very tentative and just said it was something to do with my father's background, and he would like to talk to you, and that's all I was told. When he came in, it was quite clear that though the daughter didn't have an Irish accent that he did, and that his roots were over on the island of Ireland, and that he was a Roman Catholic in the fullest believing sense that you're likely to encounter in daily life. He wasn't a priest, but he was an ordinary guy who had fully internalized that belief system. Then he disclosed what he had, which was the psoriasis. Actually, it was visible. It's not the kind of thing that you could ignore particularly, although of course you would not draw attention to the fact that you'd noticed it until somebody says that they have. This is an important thing in rapport when you're working with someone with a condition like that. So of course we get the case study, the case history, as much as he feels able to communicate it, and we then decide on what kind of approach that we're going to use. Now, this is the real reason for this particular podcast, is to discuss how you make that assessment. And with a condition like psoriasis, imagery of one form or another is very often useful. Now, you can use, say, something like hypnosis just straight off the bat without any real consideration at all about deeper rapport, deeper structures, deeper things going on in a person's life, and then utilize that to make a psychophysiological change. It's very effective at that, provided that you do understand the bigger picture. There are other forms of imagery, guided imagery, the kind of thing that you might get in behavior modification therapy or even in CBT. And then, of course, for depth psychology, there's active imagination, which is, on the surface, as I said earlier, quite different but at a deep structure level, there's a lot of overlap between all three of those approaches. The key, though, is how you frame your approach and you utilize those methods within the context, more widely, of the complete person. So in order to do that then, having gotten the case history, and we used Chevreul's pendulum and got the indication that it would be okay for us to help this person with that problem, was how do we do that? How do we get inside that? Because there's going to be resistance usually, even if Chevreul's pendulum indicates, yes, it's okay to help, it may not necessarily give you all the information you need. This is one of the best ways that I'm going to tell you about now of accessing the psyche in anybody. And it's easy and it's so obvious, but it works. If you can find out from somebody where their fantasies are, and I don't mean sexual fantasies necessarily, unless they're included in this and what they disclose, but in terms of what gets their imagination, what involves their attention and how they drift into something and lose themselves. For example, a television program, a film, novels, video games, whatever it is that takes their energy and pulls their attention into it so they become absorbed. Most people will have a core of such things that they refer to. Mind drifts off into it. It might be Star Wars, it might be something from Disney, it might be Doctor Who or Star Trek, or it might even be a soap opera. Anything like that, then you get immediately insight into their imaginal world. You also access a path of least resistance from the psyche, because by you incorporating that, you're stepping inside that world. This is a routine technique that Paul and I would use, by the way, and we still do. In the UK, Coronation Street was and still is a very popular soap opera. And we've used that many, many times as a focus for imagery. In this particular case, this gentleman was interested in a show which is no longer on the telly, but back then in the 1990s, Ballykissangel, as it was called, which was a story basically about an Irish village, and it was focused around a particular pub, because it reminded him of home and gave him a continuity for his timeline. It was very, very important to him. And he offered this when I asked him what it was that drew his attention. That then is the big indication of where we need to set his imaginal experience. So what we would do is then, having got that information, and because we'd use Chevreul's pendulum first in order to find out whether we would get the cooperation of the unconscious, at least initially, to begin the work, is to get this person used to going into trance themselves, under control of themselves, self-hypnosis. So he would be taught and was taught self-hypnosis, and he got confident with that. He realized it's not a case of opening yourself up to somebody else's influence, but accessing your own capacity for directed therapeutic change internally in a safe way. Very important, particularly with someone who has somaticized, that is to say, turned psychological stress into something which is now organic. And the information that was once psychological or psychosocial has been alchemically transformed from that level of information and representation into something else. In this case, psoriasis. It appeared on his skin. It was an exhibition of distress, visible. So he was comfortable then, having done Chevreul's pendulum and self-hypnosis, that he would be comfortable going a little deeper into that experience. So he'd already told us about Ballykissangel and the pub, and there was a barmaid in there that he was particularly drawn to. So in Jungian terms, we know his anima then was appearing as an image in that form. Very, very useful thing, again, to induce a deeper connection with himself through trance, which he was in control of. So when it came for the actual therapy, and this was only on the third session. The first session was case history and Chevreul's pendulum. The second was teaching him self-hypnosis, getting him used to that experience. And the third one was the clinical intervention. He did put himself into a self-hypnotic trance. When he was in there then, having used hypnosis to get so far, not too deep, just sufficient that he felt comfortable. We then introduced guided imagery, but it's already been augmented by the hypnotic induction. This guided imagery, which he had no idea I was going to use, I didn't disclose it at that time, but I was giving him the direct suggestion to go to Ballycott Angel. And you anchor a person then through sensory modalities, colour. The colours that he experiences through the television when he was watching the programme, sounds of voices, perhaps even of birds, the sensation beneath his feet of walking on that road, not any other road, that one. Temperature of the air on his skin and so forth. So you're engaging sensory modalities in an unimaginable way. We experience physical, material, outer reality through our senses. So through those senses, he was metaphorically making sense of the experience on the inside of being there. Led him to the pub, to the door, and then provided him with the suggestion that the answer to his problem would be found inside the pub, and it would be safe for him to experience this. And we'd already got the idiomotor confirmation from his unconscious as we led in with relatively superficial self-hypnosis that he would be all right and there wouldn't be anything threatening in there and he would get a helpful answer. So he goes in, and because he's in a moderate level of trance, he's able to communicate the experience. And that experience was, as he walked in, he saw the barmaid and she welcomed him and gave him a drink. And then over to his left, the left, which is significant in a right-handed person, and he led the way on this. I didn't suggest it. On the left, there was someone else sitting there. This person had a drink already and was waiting for him. Turned out that it was his father. The anima had provided him with the drink, which would link him over to the left with his father, who was waiting for him. He was then able to go down and sit with his father, and he just sat there at that point. So we knew that the guided imagery had gone as far as it should do. At this point, then, we have to engage active imagination. He needed to be given, and he was, the instruction, the disengaging instruction, that from this point on, it would be him who would communicate with his father. And I would know nothing about this. He would tell me, if he wished, later what the content of that communication was. So in effect, then, he'd gone into active imagination and a communication with his dad. Anyway, he did so. At the end of that, and the only reason I knew it was the end is that the finger that he was using for idiomotor signaling, which was the forefinger of his right hand, raised itself up with a spontaneous twitch. And I knew then that that meant that there had been a change of state internally, and it was time for him to come out. So at that point, as the therapist, then, we move him from active imagination into guided imagery. So he was able to leave the pub safely and then reorientate him back through the senses. So they began to disengage. So the colours would fade, the sensation of warmth on his skin or the fresh air outside would fade, and he would be gradually brought back then into a hypnotic state where you would apply a hypnotic termination to that process. And he did, and he came out of his trance, and then he was able to disclose what happened. It was obviously, you can guess from this narrative, the engagement with his father that led him to understand the nature of his psoriasis and what caused that problem for him. Surprisingly, it wasn't just his father, but he'd been blaming his father all this time, semi-consciously. So, if you like, in the name of the father, refers to the fact that he had had that in his mind, that his father is an authoritarian Irish Catholic and the control over him had led to all sorts of issues and problems and had caused this to happen to him. That was his belief. Now, his father, by the way, in the outside world was deceased. There was no way he could have had this conversation with his father externally. But even when somebody passes over from life and into metaphorically the collective unconscious, we still bear a connection to them through the residual image of our experience of them on the inside. This was an opportunity provided spontaneously by his unconscious for him to use the imago of his father to access the cause of a trauma in the past and then to reconcile that. And without going into too many details, in fact, I'll preserve the anonymity on that, he was able then to articulate to me as an external third party what had happened. to him. That was then dealt with appropriately, and he went away, and the psoriasis it gone. It started to fade and recede, and it disappeared. Years later, we were still at that practice, and his daughter told us it never came back. He'd resolved it. So what you had there was a compound use of imagery. You had standard hypnosis introduced through Chevreul's pendulum to get confirmation that the psyche would allow us to help him. Then the safe induction of self-hypnosis, so he retains the power and control over the process. Then it moved on, and it became guided imagery to prepare him to encounter something safely according to what his unconscious already was open to experiencing, which was his fantasy relationship to the characters in Balika's Angel. Now, he thought he really liked the barmaid. The barmaid was to him attractive and interesting, and she turned up in that experience as a psychopomp, which the anima does, welcomed him into the pub, and then directed him to his left to meet his deceased father. And he said he had no conscious idea that that would happen, no conscious expectation that that would happen. He just thought he was going to have a nice experience in a pub, and it wouldn't be nice, just like being on the telly. Instead, he got the answer he needed. And once he could then internalize that and understand it, his unconscious then released him from the need to have to express this issue, this trauma from the past through his skin. And it went away. So that's a clinical example in brief of how you can use hybrid forms of imagery to achieve a clinical end and get a result very, very quickly. And in there you have, in effect, cognitive behaviorism in the form of guided imagery. You have hypnotherapy, oh dear, the black arts. And then you also have active imagination in a purely Jungian sense. And of course you have the anima presence, you have the father imago, you have the psychosomatic representation, and you have the reversal of that. That's practical therapy. In your own lives, if you want to know the quickest way of getting inside your own psyche, ask yourself, where does my imagination go? What's the path of least resistance? But only do this, only if you have a stable ego, stable ego, stable conscious personality, because you will open the door to other things if you proceed without caution. So give yourself a hint about where your imagination is, and then you'll be able to get inside your psyche very, very quickly. The path of least resistance, and in his case, in the name of the Father.
Difficult as a condition to get rid of, isn't it, psoriasis?
Psoriasis
and
is, yes.
Normally when it's that severe, requires some kind of immunosuppressant injection in order to achieve that effect.
It does,
So it shows the power of these things.
It does,
doesn't it?
It does, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. And Pauline knows this because she's had psoriasis herself, if I can disclose that.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And we did work together when she was 16, and we got shut of it. So I'd already had some experience of doing it, but it wasn't achieved in Pauline's case in the same way, except insofar as we found a way to achieve the same results, but that was 42 years ago. Yeah. So in that sense, we were nothing like as experienced as we were later on. But yeah, it gave us the confidence to know that the psyche can make these changes. And later on, we just had the techniques to do it. Yes. And the confidence to work our way in and achieve things. But the basic outline of what I described is what Pauline would do routinely when it comes to using imagery. You know, where your fantasies go, where your imagination goes, and that can be a novel, it can be a film, it can be anything. That's your unconscious telling you that that's its preferred portal. And wouldn't it be rude to ignore that in someone, including in yourself, if you want to make changes? Then if you add a technique which allows you to make changes, significant changes, powerful changes very, very quickly, then you can get results in yourself quickly too.
Absolutely. And in my case, it was very severe as well.
It was, yeah.
And it was difficulty in my relationship to my father.
Yes, it was.
Who had told me to grow a thick skin.
Yeah.
In response to a difficult time I was going through in my life. So I obliged. And I have to say, obviously meeting yourself and being in a loving relationship, probably the first loving connection that I'd had to an outer man, at one level was probably in and of itself enough.
Yes. Yeah, because it was an animus issue, therefore, from the father, and I obviously offered an alternative to that. I thought we'll get this girl right, and we'll sort this. We'll break the animus's hold on her.
Yes.
You know,
And when it went, if you think about the actual, the way the disease presents, as you say, is like a scaly plaque. Strangely enough, it disappeared from the inside out. Just, they're just little details. But for me, that was significant.
Yeah, like an eruption of health from the centre.
Yes.
That could be symbolic.
It could
easily be symbolic.
Yeah, could be interpreted as that. Yeah.
But as I say, be careful about trying this stuff, though, at home. You can do it safely simply by asking yourself and examining yourself in a kind of Socratic dialectical way, where your attention, your information, and your animation in terms of fantasy comes from. And then you have the portal from which you can work and start to build therapeutic change or personal development change in yourself.